still. Give me 1 second. Okay, welcome everybody. It is another Tuesday and we are YouTube live under the Risk and Foundations and Risk Literacy class. Welcome if you're just chiming in. And tonight we're going over the benefits, protection, and risk containment. Amy, take it away.
Benefits Protection and Risk Containment, Volume 4, Protecting Benefits While Exploring Private Process. Important notice, scope and intended use. This ebook is part of the Private Foundations and Risk Literacy series. The live YouTube sessions associated with this series are provided for general education literacy only and are designed to help viewers understand administrative systems, terminology, and common sources of confusion. This ebook goes beyond the scope of the live sessions. It contains structured analysis, sequencing explanations, and reference material that is not presented publicly and is intended solely for members who have agreed to private membership association terms. This material does not provide legal advice, tax advice, or instructions for filing. It is designed to support informed decision-making and to reduce harm caused by misunderstanding administrative processes. Private membership use only. Access to this ebook is limited to members of Private Path Membership Association who have completed the membership application, agreed to the association agreement, and executed the non-disclosure agreement, NDA. Redistribution, excerpting, or use of this material outside of the PMA is prohibited. This restriction exists to ensure that the material is studied in its proper context and is not misapplied, misquoted, or used without adequate foundational understanding. The YouTube series teaches literacy. The ebook exists so students don't misapply what they learn. Private Membership Association Notice. This publication is a private educational resource made available exclusively to members of Private Path HR Solutions Private Membership Association, PMA. Access to this material is conditioned upon acceptance of the PMA membership agreement and non-disclosure agreement, NDA. Use of this publication is limited to personal educational study by authorized members. Unauthorized sharing, reproduction, distribution, or commercial use of this material, whether in whole or in part, constitutes a breach of private contract and may result in remedies available under the PMA agreement, including termination of membership and pursuit of contractual or civil relief where appropriate. Disclaimer and educational notice. This ebook is provided for educational and informational purposes only. It does not constitute legal, tax, or financial advice, and it should not be relied upon as such. The material in this publication is based on private research, historical references, and educational analysis, including concepts taught by Patrick Devine as interpreted and expanded upon by Private Path HR Solutions. The purpose of this work is to explain administrative classification, presumptions, and common sources of misunderstanding, not to instruct readers on filing, compliance, avoidance, or legal strategy. Readers are solely responsible for their own decisions, actions, filings, and outcomes. No guarantees, express or implied, are made regarding results. For matters requiring professional judgment, readers are encouraged to consult a qualified, licensed professional in the appropriate jurisdiction. Copyright and use restrictions. Copyright 2025, Private Path HR Solutions, PMA. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored, transmitted, or distributed in any form or by any means without prior written permission except for brief quotations used for private study or commentary within the PMA. References to government agencies, including the Internal Revenue Service, are descriptive and educational only. Nothing in this publication instructs or encourages evasion of lawful reporting or compliance obligations. Contact us. If you have questions, need guidance, or wish to access additional tools and consulting, our website is www.privatepathhrsolutions.com. Email privatepathhrsolutions@gmail.com. For classes@privatepathhrsolutions.com. Instagram and TikTok @privatepathhr. Private membership access available through our site. A note before you begin. This volume exists because something keeps happening that should not. People do not lose benefits because they studied. They lose benefits because they acted too soon. What you're holding is not an instruction manual. It is not a promise of protection. It is not a shortcut. It is a pause, an intentional slowing down designed to keep curiosity from turning into harm. If you are receiving public benefits of any kind, your margin for error is smaller than most people realize. That reality is not a judgment. It is simply the terrain. And before anyone starts walking new ground, they need to understand where the cliffs are. This volume was written for that reason. Why this volume was written. Most private education focuses on possibility. What can be structured? What can be reclassified? What can be done differently? Very little time is spent explaining what must remain untouched while learning is still in progress. The gap between curiosity and execution is where people get hurt. This volume fills that gap. It exists because public benefit systems do not evaluate intent. They evaluate appearance, access, control, and activity. They do not ask whether someone meant well or was still learning. They respond to signals. Once those signals are triggered, the process moves forward whether the individual is ready or not. This book slows that moment down. Private study does not mean private consequences. One of the most damaging misconceptions in this space is the idea that private study occurs in a vacuum. That learning about trust, fiduciary roles, or private process somehow exists outside the awareness or reach of public systems. That is not how reality works. Public benefit systems do not care what someone believes about privacy. They care what can be observed, reported, accessed, or inferred. They respond to patterns, not philosophies, and they act long before a person feels ready. This volume is here to explain that, calmly, without fear, and without exaggeration, so that understanding replaces assumption. What this volume is meant to do. This book is meant to give you sight before movement. It does not ask you to stop learning. It asks you to learn without triggering events that you cannot undo. It is written to help you recognize which actions are harmless during study and which actions quietly change your risk profile the moment they occur. You will not be shown how to set anything up here. You will not be told how to file anything. You will not be given language to use with agencies or instructions for moving money or receiving compensation. That absence is intentional. Protection begins with restraint. The benefits reality no one explains first. Social Security, disability programs, and veterans benefits operate on assumptions that are rarely explained in plain language. People are told what forms to fill out, but not how decisions are actually made. They're told what is allowed, but not what invites scrutiny. This volume pulls back the curtain on that process. It explains how benefit systems differentiate retirement from disability, how needs-based assistance is evaluated differently from earned benefits, and how fiduciary involvement can change the posture of the agency overnight. Not to scare you, to prepare you. A word about trusts and income. At some point in your education, you will hear claims about trust income being invisible, excluded, or irrelevant. You may hear that control can be separated cleanly, or that labeling alone changes reporting obligations. Those claims sound appealing because they offer certainty in an uncertain world. This volume does not argue, it explains. It shows how agencies interpret access and benefit, why assumptions collapse under review, and why the phrase, "I didn't touch it," carries far less weight than people expect. Understanding this before action is the difference between education and exposure. How to read this volume. This is not a book to rush through. It is meant to be read while nothing is happening, so that nothing happens later. If you're currently receiving benefits, this volume asks you to stay exactly where you are while you build understanding. There is no prize for speed here. There is no penalty for waiting. The only real loss occurs when action precedes clarity. Before we go further, if you finish this volume and feel relief, that is the point. Relief means you now see the boundaries. Boundaries create safety. Safety allows learning to continue without fear. This volume is not a path forward. It is a guardrail. Once it is understood, the road ahead becomes much clearer. Introduction. Why this volume matters. There is a moment that almost everyone reaches in private study when the material starts to feel powerful. Concepts connect, language sharpens. The world looks different than it did before. And in that moment, the temptation is to do something, to apply what has been learned before the learning is complete. Patrick Devine never taught that moment as a point of execution. He taught it as a point of discernment. What has happened since, however, is something very different. Across the internet, fragments of his work have been pulled out of sequence, stripped of context, and repackaged into action-first narratives. The quiet warnings were removed. The timing was ignored. The distinction between education and execution collapsed. What remained were promises, often well-intentioned, often confidently delivered, that encouraged people to move before they were ready. This volume exists because those promises are costing people their benefits. Not because the underlying ideas are dangerous, but because they are being applied without the literacy required to understand the terrain they are being applied within. The difference between teaching and triggering. Patrick Devine's work is fundamentally about jurisdiction, capacity, and sequence. It is about understanding systems before interacting with them. At no point was it intended to be a checklist for immediate action, especially for individuals already embedded in public benefit frameworks. What many modern gurus do instead is collapse years of conceptual development into short-form certainty. They present trust language as camouflage. They describe private process as invisibility. They frame benefit systems as naive or powerless, rather than as administrative machines designed specifically to detect inconsistency, access, and control. In doing so, they shift the student's posture from learner to actor far too soon. This volume corrects that shift. Benefits are not a side issue. One of the most serious omissions in modern private education is the failure to address benefits as a primary risk category rather than a footnote. Social Security, disability programs, and veterans benefits are not passive. They are monitored environments governed by rules that do not pause simply because someone is studying something new. Patrick Devine understood this. He spoke carefully. He assumed maturity and patience. He did not encourage people to treat public systems as adversaries to be bypassed. He emphasized standing, timing, and comprehension. Gurus rarely do. They speak in absolutes. They imply safety where none exists. They suggest labels override behavior. And when consequences appear, they blame the individual for doing it wrong, rather than acknowledging that the instruction itself was incomplete. This volume is written to stop that cycle. Literacy before leverage. Private process is not magic. It does not nullify oversight. It does not erase reporting frameworks. It does not protect people from consequences when applied out of sequence. What it does offer, when taught correctly, is understanding. This book does not argue with public systems. It does not challenge them. It does not attempt to outmaneuver them. Instead, it explains how they function so that the reader can make informed decisions about when not to act. That restraint is not weakness. It is intelligence. Why this volume comes out before action. Many students assume that risk only begins when money moves or paperwork is filed. In reality, risk often begins early, when assumptions change behavior, when conversations shift, when records are created unnecessarily, or when someone believes they are protected simply because they have learned a new language. This volume brings that invisible line into view. It teaches the reader how benefit systems interpret activity, why disability is evaluated differently than retirement, how fiduciary involvement changes oversight, and why trust myths collapse under review. Not to discourage exploration, but to ensure that exploration does not become self-inflicted harm. A necessary correction. This volume is not a rejection of Patrick Devine's work. It is a restoration of its original discipline. It stands in contrast to guru culture by not attacking it, but by slowing the reader down enough to see what is missing. It reminds the student that timing matters, that benefits are real, and that protection begins with understanding, not execution. If this volume prevents even one person from losing benefits they cannot easily recover, it has done its job. And if it gets quieter, slower, and more cautious than what you've seen elsewhere, that is intentional. Private literacy was never meant to be loud. Opening passage. The quiet risk nobody mentions. It usually does not begin with a mistake. It begins with confidence, not the loud kind, the kind that comes from finally feeling worthy. The kind that settles in after weeks or months of reading, listening, connecting dots. The language starts to make sense. The systems no longer feel mysterious. There is relief in that understanding, and the relief has a way of loosening caution. Most people remember exactly where they were when it happened. The kitchen table, our car, the quiet moment between obligations. The envelope looked ordinary. The subject line sounded procedural. Nothing about it suggested danger. It was not a notice of wrongdoing. It was not an accusation. It was a request. That is how it often begins. A clarification, a review, a routine inquiry. Language that feels neutral enough to dismiss, until the words are read a second time, slower now, with a tightening in the chest. A realization sets in that something shifted, and it happened without any clear moment to point to. No one remembers deciding to cross the line. They remember believing that they hadn't. Most people in this position are not reckless, they're curious. They're trying to understand their options, not change their status. They were learning, not acting. So they thought. Somewhere along the way, an assumption slipped in unnoticed. Their learning privately meant remaining unseen. That understanding systems did not itself create signals. That nothing counted until money moved or paperwork was filed. But systems do not wait for intent. They respond to patterns, to activity, to access, to the quiet accumulation of signals that look ordinary in isolation but tell a different story when viewed together. By the time that letter arrives, the system is already awake. This is the part no one prepares you for. The moment when you realize that education does not announce itself as education. That curiosity can look like capacity. That preparation can look like readiness. And that benefit systems do not pause to ask whether someone felt done learning before responding. There is often a rush to rewind, to find the exact step when things went wrong. But the truth is harder to accept. Nothing went wrong all at once. It happened gradually, visibly, through small shifts that felt harmless at the time. A conversation, a new assumption, a change in posture. None of it felt like action, and yet something moved. This volume exists for the moment before that letter arrives. For the moment when understanding is growing but nothing irreversible has happened yet. For the space where learning can continue safely without creating consequences that cannot be undone. If you're reading this and nothing feels urgent, that's good. That means this book arrived when it was supposed to. Its purpose is not to make you afraid. It is to make you aware so that curiosity remains curiosity and learning remains learning. Because the most dangerous mistake in this space is not doing something wrong. It's doing something too soon. When you're ready, turn the page. This is where clarity begins. Chapter 1. When curiosity becomes a signal. Introduction. Most people begin this journey because they want clarity, not conflict. They're not trying to disrupt their lives. They're not looking to challenge systems or invite attention. They're simply trying to understand how things work, often years of feeling confused, constrained, and dependent on processes they never fully understood. That desire to understand is not reckless. It's human. What rarely gets explained, however, is that understanding itself can change how someone is perceived, long before they believe they've done anything at all. This chapter exists to explain that quiet shift, not to warn you away from learning, but to help you recognize when learning begins to alter posture in ways that matter. How risk is commonly misunderstood. Risk is often imagined as an event. A form is filed, money moves, an account opens, something official happens, and consequences follow. That framing feels logical, which is why so many people rely on it. Unfortunately, it does not reflect how benefit systems actually operate. People tend to assume that consequences appear only when something concrete occurs, when paperwork is submitted, or financial activity begins. As long as nothing formal has happened, they believe nothing has changed. But that assumption overlooks how administrative systems actually observe people. Risk rarely begins with a single decisive action. More often, it begins quietly through a gradual shift in how someone appears to interact with the world around them. Understanding this distinction is essential before any further discussion can take place. How benefit systems actually observe people. Public benefit systems do not wait for decisive moments. They observe continuity. These systems are built to notice patterns over time rather than singular acts. Small changes, when accumulated, begin to tell the story, whether the individual intended to tell it or not. As people study private process, their internal orientation changes first. They become more aware of language, more precise in how they describe themselves, more confident in navigating concepts that once felt foreign. These changes feel personal and internal, but they often surface externally in subtle ways. A person answers questions differently. They frame their circumstances with more structure. They speak with a level of authority they did not previously claim. None of this is improper. None of it is dishonest. But within benefit systems, these shifts can carry meaning that the individual never intended to communicate. Disability programs, for example, are not evaluating whether someone tries to work. They evaluate whether someone appears capable of sustained, organized activity. Retirement programs are not concerned with philosophy or future plans. They focus on access, earnings, and engagement. Needs-based programs do not ask what someone believes about money. They assess what appears available. These systems are not adversarial, they are administrative. They respond to what can be inferred, not what is meant. This is where confusion often begins. People assume that because they have not filed anything or moved anything, nothing has changed. They assume learning is invisible, that study exists outside observation. But posture, the way someone carries understanding into the world, often changes before execution ever does. And that change is what systems notice. Why modern teaching often skips this stage. But feeling informed is not the same thing as being prepared. Patrick Devine did not teach that way. His work assumed patience. It assumed maturity. It treated understanding as something to be integrated slowly, not deployed immediately. What has been lost that much of today's teachings is not information, it is restraint. And restraint in this context is not hesitation, it is intelligence. The modern online environment rarely addresses this stage. Much of what is taught jumps directly to outcomes, skipping the quieter phase where comprehension grows faster than protection. Timing collapses. Discernment is replaced with momentum. People are encouraged to feel ready simply because they feel informed. Closing. This chapter is not meant to make you feel cautious of learning. It is meant to make you aware of when learning begins to signal readiness, even if you do not feel ready at all. Nothing here requires you to stop. Nothing here asks you to retreat. It simply invites you to notice the difference between curiosity and capacity, between understanding and action. When that distinction is clear, the rest of this volume makes sense. In the next chapter, we will address one of the most common and costly misunderstandings in this entire space: the assumption that Social Security is a single system governed by a single set of rules. It is not. And recognizing that difference early is one of the most important forms of protection available to anyone receiving benefits. For now, let this chapter settle. Awareness is not limitation. It is preparation. Chapter 2. Social Security is not one system. Introduction. Most people use the phrase Social Security as if it refers to a single program. It sounds unified, stable, predictable. Something you either receive or you do not. The checks come from the same agency, the terminology appears familiar, and the system is commonly spoken about as if it operates under one set of rules. That assumption is understandable. It is also one of the most common sources of preventable confusion. Social Security is not one system. It is several programs operating side by side, each built on a different purpose and each evaluating recipients under a different set of assumptions. Confusing those assumptions rarely causes immediate problems. Instead, the consequences tend to emerge slowly over time, when behavior begins to conflict with the expectations built into the specific programs someone is receiving. Understanding these distinctions early is one of the most important forms of protection available to anyone receiving benefits. Why people assume Social Security is one program. For most recipients, the experience of Social Security appears straightforward. Payments arrive on a predictable schedule. Communication comes from the same agency. The terminology used in public discussions rarely distinguishes between the programs involved. As a result, people often assume that the rules governing Social Security are universal. Advice is frequently shared in general terms. Social Security allows this. Social Security does not count that. Social Security rules say this is acceptable. The problem with statements like these is that they are rarely specific about which Social Security program is actually being discussed. What may be acceptable in one program may raise questions under another. Without understanding which framework applies, people may unknowingly rely on guidance that was never meant for their situation. This is where confusion begins to translate into risk. The three different logics of Social Security. Social Security programs are not simply variations of the same system. Each one is designed to answer a different question about the person receiving benefits. Retirement benefits are based on work history and age. The system evaluates whether a person has reached the age and contribution thresholds required to receive payments from the system they paid into during their working years. Under retirement programs, life is expected to continue normally. Individuals may work within certain limits, engage in planning, and manage their financial affairs without that activity automatically raising concerns. The system's primary focus is earning thresholds, not personal capacity. Disability benefits, by contrast, operate under a completely different logic. Disability programs are not evaluating past contributions or age. They are evaluating present ability. The system's question is whether a person is capable of sustained, gainful activity under defined conditions. Because of this focus, disability systems often evaluate patterns of activity, organization, and engagement that might not matter under retirement programs. What appears ordinary under one program may carry different implications under another. Supplemental Security Income, SSI, introduces a third framework. SSI is a needs-based program. Its focus is for access to resources. This system evaluates what appears available to the recipient, financially or materially, and whether those sources align with the program's premise of limited needs. The system is not asking whether funds were earned in a traditional sense. It is asking whether resources exist in a way that alters the underlying assumption of need. These differences are not minor technicalities. They are foundational distinctions that shape how behavior is interpreted. Why confusing these programs creates risk. When people hear general statements about Social Security rules, they often apply those statements across programs without realizing that the assumptions behind those programs are different. Advice that is accurate for retirement recipients may be misleading for someone receiving disability benefits. Information that is irrelevant for disability programs may carry significant weight within SSI evaluations. This mismatch between advice and context is one of the primary reasons misunderstandings occur. Online education frequently contributes to the confusion by collapsing these programs into a single category. Broad statements are made about Social Security without clarifying which framework is actually being discussed. Students hear assurances that certain actions do not matter, do not count, without being taught how those actions are interpreted under different benefit structures. Patrick Devine's original teachings emphasize understanding systems before interacting with them. His discussions about jurisdiction, standing, and administrative posture assumed that the student would first understand the environment in which those concepts operate. What many modern interpretations have removed is that initial step of orientation. When the distinctions between programs are ignored, people may begin adjusting their behavior based on incomplete assumptions. That adjustment may appear harmless in the moment, but over time it can create inconsistencies between the program's expectations and the individual's capacity, activity. The system does not interpret those inconsistencies philosophically. It interprets them administratively. Closing. Understanding that Social Security is not a single system changes how the rest of this volume should be read. It explains why two people can take the same action and experience very different outcomes. It clarifies why confident advice may be incomplete, and why generalized guidance can create exposure where none previously existed. This chapter is not meant to restrict learning. It is meant to provide orientation. Once you understand which question your specific program is asking, it becomes easier to recognize when behavior begins to conflict with that question long before consequences occur. In the next chapter, we will narrow the focus further by examining disability programs specifically, how work, activity, and ability are interpreted, and why well-intentioned assumptions often collide with disability standards in ways people do not anticipate. For now, allow this distinction to settle. Clarity is not complexity, it is protection. Caveat: where people misunderstand the estate. At this point in the conversation, it is common for a particular idea to surface. People begin to hear the word estate and assume it refers to a specific account, a balance, or a container that can be taken over, redirected, shut down, or reassigned. Some people believe this estate is the Social Security number itself. Others believe it can be closed, converted, or transferred once certain documents are prepared. This assumption is one of the most dangerous misunderstandings in modern private education. Patrick Devine spoke about estates in a conceptual and jurisdictional sense. He was addressing standing, capacity, and how public systems relate to individuals in law and equity. He was not teaching that a Social Security number is a vault that can be empty, nor that benefits flow from a controllable account waiting to be reassigned. What has happened since is a collapse of metaphor into mechanics. People hear estate and imagine funds. People hear executor and imagine authority over payments. They hear fiduciary and assume insulation from review. None of those assumptions are supported by how benefit systems actually operate. Social Security benefits do not exist because an estate is being paid out. They exist because statutory conditions are being met in real time. The system does not disperse funds because ownership has shifted, but because eligibility remains intact. When eligibility is questioned, payments stop. Not because paperwork failed, but because assumptions no longer align. This is where people get hurt. They believe they are reclaiming something, when in reality they are signaling a change in posture that the system is obligated to examine. They believe they are operating privately, when in fact they are introducing inconsistencies that invite review. There are also claims circulating that certain federal forms or administrative instruments can be used to redirect, secure, or protect benefits while maintaining eligibility. These claims are often presented with confidence and certainty, but they share a critical flaw. They're not supported by consistent, verifiable outcomes. That does not mean people have not attempted them. It means success has not been demonstrated in a way that withstands scrutiny. Teaching people to rely on unproven methods, especially when benefits are involved, is not education, it is exposure. This volume intentionally does not explain how such methods will be executed, because doing so would imply reliability that has not been established. Patrick Devine emphasized discernment. He did not encourage people to experiment with benefit systems. He did not frame published programs as adversaries to be defeated. He assumed a level of maturity that included knowing when not to act. What many modern interpretations removed was that restraint. They replaced it with urgency. If you are receiving Social Security benefits, the most important thing to understand is this: eligibility is behavioral before it is documentary. No document can substitute for alignment with the assumptions the system is designed to enforce. No form can override capacity tests, access tests, or other availability standards simply by being filed. Understanding this does not limit you, it protects you. This caveat is not meant to close doors. It is meant to keep them from slamming shut prematurely. There may come a time when deeper administrative or fiduciary discussions are appropriate. but that time is not before literacy is complete, and it is never while benefits are at risk. Let this distinction settle before moving on. In the next chapter, we will narrow the lens further and look at disability specifically, where these misunderstandings cause the most immediate and irreversible harm. Chapter 3, Disability, Work, and the Meaning of Ability. Introduction. Disability programs are often misunderstood because people assume they are measuring effort. They are not. Most individuals receiving disability benefits are working harder than anyone sees, managing health, navigating limitations, and adapting to constraints that may be invisible to others. Because of that lived reality, it can feel deeply unfair when questions arise that appear to ignore effort entirely. But disability systems are not built to measure struggle. They're built to measure capacity. This chapter exists to explain that difference because confusing the two is one of the fastest ways people unintentionally place themselves at risk. Effort and capacity are not the same thing. From the system's perspective, disability is not a moral category. It is not a reward for suffering, nor a recognition of perseverance. It is an administrative determination of whether someone can engage in sustained, gainful activity under defined conditions. That distinction matters. Effort is internal. Capacity is inferred. Disability programs are designed to look outward. They assess what a person appears able to do consistently, not how difficult it may feel or how much energy it requires. The system does not see exhaustion, it sees organization. It does not see pain, it sees continuity. The difference between lived experience and administrative evaluation is where many misunderstandings begin. How disability programs interpret activity. Work within disability evaluations is not limited to a paycheck. The system often evaluates activity more broadly by observing patterns over time. Regular engagement in structured tasks, ongoing coordination, or sustained involvement in organized efforts may all contribute to how capacity is interpreted. This does not mean that thinking, learning, or planning is prohibited. It means that when activity begins to appear structured, organized, and ongoing, it can be interpreted as evidence of functional capacity. For example, individuals studying private administrative concepts often develop new habits. They organize records. They research systems. They communicate more formally. They structure information and planning more deliberately. None of these behaviors are improper. However, when they occur consistently and publicly, they can contribute to an external perception of capability that the system is designed to evaluate. Disability programs are not examining intention. They are observing patterns of activity. Why private process narratives often collide with disability standards. Many discussions about trusts and private administrative processes use language centered on structure, coordination, and management. Terms such as trustee, fiduciary, administrator, or manager describe roles that imply oversight and responsibility. Within private education, these terms are often used conceptually to explain systems of responsibility and authority. Within disability evaluations, however, those same descriptions may appear differently. If someone appears capable of managing assets, coordinating decisions, directing activity, or sustaining structured responsibility over time, the system may reasonably evaluate whether the assumptions underlying disability status still align with observable activity. This is not a judgment about a person's integrity. It is an administrative evaluation of consistency. When language of authority and demonstrated patterns of organized activity begin to appear together, disability systems may interpret those signals as evidence of functional capacity. This is why assumptions that certain activities do not count can be misleading when taken out of context. Patrick Devine's discussions about administrative roles assumed maturity, sequencing, and timing. They were not presented as instructions for individuals to immediately adopt operational roles while still under disability evaluation frameworks. Understanding that distinction helps prevent misunderstandings that could otherwise arise. Closing. Disability programs are designed to observe consistency over time. They are not evaluating effort, intention, or belief. They are observing whether circumstances continue to align with the conditions under which support was granted. When alignment remains clear, the system remains quiet. When that alignment becomes unclear, attention may follow. This chapter is not asking you to prove anything, demonstrate anything, or change your behavior. Its purpose is simply to place assumptions with clarity before misunderstandings can take root. In the next chapter, we will examine veterans' benefits and how oversight can change when systems begin to reassess capacity and protection. For now, nothing needs to be addressed. Awareness is sufficient. Chapter 4, Veterans' Benefits and the Moment Oversight Changes. Introduction. Veterans' benefits carry a different weight, not because they are more fragile, but because they are governed by a different kind of responsibility. The Department of Veterans Affairs does not view itself simply as a benefits administrator. It sees itself as a steward of public funds, determinations of need, and the long-term welfare of the veteran. Because of that responsibility, oversight within VA systems does not necessarily wait for failure or wrongdoing. It can change posture the moment certain assumptions are questioned. This chapter exists to explain that shift before it surprises anyone. Why VA benefits operate differently. Many veterans assume that VA benefits operate similarly to other public programs. Payments arrive regularly, reviews occur periodically, paperwork is exchanged. On the surface, the experience may appear familiar to other benefit systems, but the logic beneath VA oversight is different. VA systems are built around a balance between capacity and protection. When the VA determines that a veteran can manage their affairs independently, benefits typically continue with minimal intervention. When that assumption changes, the system's posture can change as well. Oversight does not necessarily increase gradually. Instead, it may shift into a different form of review or supervision designed to ensure that benefits are being managed appropriately. Understanding that possibility is important because many people assume oversight only increases after a clear mistake. In reality, oversight can shift when the system perceives changes in how responsibility or management is expressed. Fiduciary oversight is triggered. With MBA systems, fiduciary involvement is not triggered by documents alone. It is not caused simply by the existence of a trust, a representative, or an organized administrative structure. Instead, the VA evaluates whether the veteran appears able to manage their financial affairs independently and consistently. When that assessment becomes uncertain, fiduciary review may occur. The system is not evaluating private concepts or theoretical structures. It is evaluating consistency. Consistency between stated limitations and demonstrated activity. Consistency between the level of support someone is receiving and the level of control they appear to exercise over their affairs. Consistency between protection and independence. If those elements begin to diverge, the system may initiate review in order to assess how benefits should be administered. This process is administrative rather than adversarial. It exists to ensure that benefits are aligned with the veteran's circumstances. Why increased complexity can increase scrutiny? A common misunderstanding within private education is the belief that additional structure automatically reduces oversight. People sometimes assume that creating private arrangements, assigning titles, or organizing administrative roles will make systems less likely to intervene. Within VA systems, the opposite can sometimes occur. Introducing additional layers of coordination or management can signal increased capability, rather than reduced responsibility. From the system's perspective, greater organization may suggest that an individual has the capacity to direct complex activities. This does not mean that organization itself is improper. It means that systems evaluate outcomes rather than labels. If an arrangement changes how decisions are made, how resources are accessed, or how responsibilities are carried out, those changes can fall within the scope of VA evaluation regardless of how the arrangement is described. Patrick Devine's discussions about administrative standing and fiduciary concepts were intended as educational explanations of systems. They were not framed as invitations to provoke institutional response or introduce complexity prematurely. Understanding that distinction helps maintain the separation between learning about systems and interacting with them. Closing. Veterans' benefits do not operate on confrontation or declaration. They operate on continuity. Oversight within VA systems does not intensify because someone studies private concepts, adopts new language, or seeks understanding. It changes when the system perceives a shift in how protection, capacity, and control are expressed over time. This chapter is not an invitation to assert, correct, or engage. It exists to clarify that private learning does not remove a veteran from VA consideration, and that introducing complexity without full literacy often alters oversight sooner than expected. Nothing needs to be addressed. Nothing needs to be fixed. Nothing needs to be proven. Understanding how oversight changes is enough. In the next chapter, we will step beyond any single system and look at how reviews begin more broadly, not through dramatic acts, but through patterns that emerge quietly across time, behavior, and administration. For now, let this distinction settle. In VA systems, attention does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it simply changes shape. Caveat: where VA fiduciary concepts are being misapplied. At this point in the discussion, it is important to pause and address a misunderstanding that has become increasingly common in modern private education. Some instructors now present fiduciary language as if it provides insulation from government oversight. Students are sometimes encouraged to believe that assigning titles such as trustee, fiduciary, or executive automatically places them outside the administrative reach of benefit systems, including the Department of Veterans Affairs. This interpretation is not supported by how VA systems actually operate. The VA does not evaluate labels, it evaluates outcomes. If an arrangement affects access to funds, control of resources, or management of benefits, the VA may review that arrangement regardless of how it is described. Patrick understood this distinction. When Patrick Devine discussed fiduciary standing and administrative posture, he was speaking about jurisdictional understanding and personal capacity. His teaching assumed patience, maturity, and careful sequencing. It was not presented as a method for avoiding oversight or shielding activity from benefit systems. What modern interpretations have done is remove that discipline. Fragments of Devine's work are often presented as if they authorize immediate action. Students are encouraged to restructure responsibilities, adopt fiduciary language, or reorganize financial relationships before they fully understand how those actions appear within existing benefit frameworks. For individuals receiving VA benefits, this kind of premature action can create serious problems. The VA is not evaluating philosophical arguments about jurisdiction. It is evaluating whether veterans' circumstances continue to align with the conditions under which benefits were granted. When complexity is introduced without full understanding, it can signal increased capacity rather than increased protection. Teaching people to rely on labels or administrative language as a shield against oversight is not responsible instruction. Patrick Devine emphasized discernment and timing. He assumes students will first understand the systems they were operating within before attempting to alter how they interacted with them. This volume follows that same principle. Understanding systems comes first. Action, if it ever occurs, must come later. Patrick Devine consistently emphasized that jurisdiction must be understood before authority is asserted. Without that sequencing, administrative systems interpret actions based on their own frameworks, not the student's intentions. Chapter 5. The actions that invite a second look. Introduction. Most people assume that reviews begin with a mistake. They imagine a clear violation, a form filled out incorrectly, a rule misunderstood, or a requirement overlooked. In that framing, scrutiny feels like a direct consequence of wrongdoing. That assumption is comforting. It is also misleading. Reviews across benefit systems rarely begin with a single misstep. More often, they begin when ordinary activity gradually forms a pattern that no longer aligns with the assumptions under which benefits were originally granted. This chapter exists to make that process visible before it becomes personal. Reviews rarely begin with a single mistake. Public benefit systems are designed to observe change. Not dramatic change, but directional change. Subtle shifts in how someone appears to interact with money, one's responsibility, and independence over time. These systems do not require certainty before responding. They require only enough change to justify looking more closely. This is why many people feel surprised when attention appears. Nothing felt decisive. No clear boundaries seemed to have been crossed. Yet over time, a picture began to form that no longer matched the original assumptions supporting the benefit. From the system's perspective, that picture is what matters. Reviews are rarely about a single movement. They're about the story that accumulated activity appears to tell. The patterns that agencies commonly notice. Several types of activity often contribute to the patterns that attract administrative attention. One of the most common involves changes in financial movement. When access to funds changes, whether through new accounts, new arrangements, or shifts in financial flow, it can signal a change in circumstance. This will not mean the activity is improper. It means the system may interpret it as relevant to eligibility. Third-party involvement can also change how activity is perceived. When others begin coordinating, managing, or facilitating actions on someone's behalf, the appearance of support can begin to resemble organized management. Assistance may begin to look like structure. Structure may begin to look like capacity. Another contributor is administrative over-engagement. People often believe that providing more explanation, more documentation, or more context will reduce misunderstanding. In many cases, the opposite occurs. Every additional explanation expands the record. Each clarification creates another reference point. Over time, these details interact with one another in ways the individual may not anticipate. None of these elements are problematic on their own, but systems rarely evaluate elements individually. They evaluate patterns. How patterns gradually lead to reviews. When several changes begin to appear together, the overall picture may begin to shift. Financial movement combined with organized public coordination. Third-party involvement combined with structured activity. Increased organization combined with consistent engagement. Individually, these changes may appear ordinary. Together, they can suggest that circumstances are evolving. Administrative systems exist to ensure that benefits remain aligned with the conditions under which they were granted. When that alignment becomes uncertain, review is often the next step. This process is not inherently adversarial. It is administrative. The system is not reacting to a single event. It is responding to a pattern that has gradually come into focus. Understanding this helps explain why reviews can be sudden, even when nothing sudden occurred. Closing. They assume that labels change how access and benefit are evaluated. Many people believe that risk disappears once something is placed inside a trust, renamed, or described differently. They do not. In the next chapter, we will examine why assumptions on trust income often create the very exposure people believe they are avoiding, and how benefit systems evaluate access and control regardless of terminology. For now, nothing needs to change. Simply recognizing how patterns form is enough. Patterns do not announce themselves. They emerge slowly through ordinary decisions made without full visibility into how those decisions may be interpreted. Understanding that process is one of the most important forms of protection available while learning continues. Chapter 6. The problem with assuming trust income is safe. Introduction. At some point in private study, a quiet assumption begins to form. It sounds reasonable at first, reassuring even. The idea that once something is placed inside a trust, it is no longer viewed the same way. That income becomes different. That access is softened. That labels alter reality. This assumption is rarely stated directly. Instead, it settles in gradually as understanding grows. And it is one of the most common sources of preventable misunderstanding. This chapter exists to slow that assumption down before it hardens into belief. Where trust misconception begins. Trusts are often introduced through language of separation. Separation of ownership from control, separation of benefit from access, separation of management from personal activity. On paper, these distinctions matter. In legal theory, they are foundational to fiduciary thinking and the administration of trusts. The problem is not that these concepts are incorrect. The problem is how they are interpreted. When people first encounter trust structures, it can be easy to assume that separation automatically changes how systems evaluate resources. The reasoning appears straightforward. If something belongs to a trust, then it is no longer associated with the individual. But administrative systems rarely evaluate ownership in isolation. They evaluate relationships. The question is not only who owns something, the question is who can access it, who can benefit from it, and how consistently that benefit appears available. When those relationships remain connected, the underlying assumption of separation may not function the way people expect. How benefit systems evaluate access and control. Benefit systems do not rely solely on labels. They evaluate practical realities. Who can draw support from an arrangement? Who directs how resources are used? Who benefits from the outcome? These questions shape how systems interpret financial relationships. A trust name does not answer them. A title alone does not resolve them. A declaration does not remove them from consideration. If an arrangement provides access to resources, support, or advantage, that relationship may still be relevant to eligibility evaluations. This is why assumptions about trust income being invisible or separate can create confusion. From the system's perspective, what matters most is whether something appears available. Ownership alone does not determine that. Access, control, and benefit often carry more weight. Why structure alone does not remove evaluation. Trust structures can serve legitimate administrative and fiduciary purposes. They can clarify responsibility, organize resources, and provide a framework for management. But structure alone does not remove evaluation. Administrative systems assess the practical effects of an arrangement rather than the terminology used to describe it. If a trust arrangement changes how resources are accessed, how needs are met, or how activity is supported, those changes may still be relevant to eligibility frameworks. This does not mean trusts are inherently problematic. It means that structure does not automatically neutralize scrutiny. Much of the confusion in modern private education arises when trust concepts are presented as if they automatically remove financial activity from administrative consideration. Patrick Devine's discussions about trust were part of a broader conversation about standing, comprehension, and administrative systems. They were not presented as guarantees of insulation. Understanding this distinction restores the discipline that often disappears when concepts are separated from the sequence in which they were originally taught. Closing. This is the point where many learners begin to confuse comprehension with permission. Understanding trust structures does not automatically make financial activity safe. It does not change how compensation is interpreted, and it does not neutralize how money is evaluated once it begins to move. Those realities exist regardless of intent, terminology, or structure. The next chapter addresses the moment where this distinction becomes most important. Before money ever moves, certain conditions must already exist. Understanding why that boundary matters can prevent consequences that cannot easily be reversed. For now, one principle is enough. Understanding why something carries risk is not the same as being ready to touch it. Chapter 7. What must be true before money ever moves. Introduction. There is a moment in learning when ideas begin to feel usable. Concepts settle. Language becomes familiar. Structures that once seemed abstract begin to feel understandable. At that point, many people naturally begin to think about how what they have learned might apply to real life. Often, that moment turns attention towards money. Not out of impatience, but out of a natural desire to integrate understanding with practical activity. This chapter exists to pause at that moment. Not because money is inherently dangerous, but because money is decisive. The moment financial movement begins, learning shifts into activity. And once activity begins, administrative systems respond whether the learner feels ready or not. Understanding that transition is essential before anything moves. The moment learning becomes activity. Up to this point, most learning occurs internally. People read, they listen, they reflect. They reorganize how they understand systems. These actions change understanding, but they do not necessarily change circumstances. Money is different. Financial activity produces effects outside the learner's internal world. Transactions create records. Records create visibility. Visibility creates interpretation. The moment money moves, systems begin evaluating that movement in relation to everything else they observe. What was once private learning can begin to appear as operational behavior. This shift does not require wrongdoing. It simply reflects how administrative environments interpret financial activity. Understanding that distinction helps explain why financial movement represents a significant boundary. Why financial movement changes administrative posture. Many learners assume readiness arrives when something makes sense. When a concept feels clear, it can seem natural to begin applying it. But readiness is not simply a feeling, it is a condition. Administrative systems do not evaluate whether someone feels prepared. They evaluate observable circumstances. Once money begins to move, that activity is interpreted in context. Existing benefits. Prior representations, demonstrated capacity, and patterns of behavior. Financial movement does not reset that context. It becomes part of it. From the system's perspective, the question is not why money moved. The question is that it moved. That single change can alter how the entire picture is interpreted. Why waiting preserves protection. Because financial movement changes administrative posture, timing becomes extremely important. Waiting is often misunderstood as hesitation or inaction. In reality, waiting can serve a protective function. It keeps learning separate from activity. It allows understanding to develop without introducing new signals into administrative environments that are designed to respond to change. Patrick Devine spoke frequently about timing when discussing administrative systems. Understanding the environment before interacting with it was central to that discipline. When sequencing is reversed, individuals may begin acting before they understand how their actions will be interpreted. Waiting preserves optionality. Once financial activity occurs, that moment cannot be undone. Understanding this boundary allows learning to continue without prematurely forcing systems to respond. Closing. This chapter does not exist to delay progress. It exists to protect it. Money is not the first step in private learning. It is the point at which learning begins to affect the outside world. Recognizing that distinction early prevents consequences that cannot easily be reversed later. Nothing in this chapter asks you to decide when money should move. It simply clarifies why movement carries weight sooner than many people expect. When learning remains separate from financial activity, understanding has room to deepen. And when understanding deepens first, decisions about action can occur from a position of clarity rather than urgency. That discipline is one of the most important forms of protection available while learning continues. Chapter 8. Learning without triggering consequences. Introduction. By the time someone reaches this point in their study, a natural question begins to surface. If learning can change how systems interpret behavior, how can someone continue studying without unintentionally creating consequences? This question is reasonable. Curiosity does not disappear simply because risks exist. People still want to understand systems, explore ideas, and expand their knowledge. Learning itself is not the problem. The challenge lies in understanding how to remain in an educational posture without unintentionally signaling operational activity. This chapter exists to clarify that distinction. The goal is not to stop learning. The goal is to learn without triggering events that administrative systems are designed to respond to. The difference between learning and operating. Learning and operating may feel similar from the inside, but they appear very different from the outside. Learning is exploratory. It involves reading, studying concepts, analyzing systems, and gradually building understanding. These activities occur primarily within the individual's internal process of comprehension. Operating, by contrast, produces outward effects. It involves financial movement, administrative assertions, structural changes, or actions that create records within institutional environments. Once those outward signals appear, systems begin interpreting them. The key distinction is not intent, it is visibility. When learning remains internal, it rarely produces signals that systems interpret as optional operational change. When activity becomes external, through financial movement, formal roles, or administrative restructuring, it begins interacting with the frameworks those systems enforce. Understanding this difference allows study to continue without unintentionally crossing into activity. How educational curiosity can appear as activity. One of the challenges in modern online education is that curiosity is often encouraged without clear boundaries. Students may feel motivated to test ideas, restructure responsibilities, or experiment with concepts they have only recently encountered. These actions rarely feel significant in the moment, but administrative systems evaluate patterns rather than intentions. When curiosity begins producing outward signals, a new financial arrangement, changes in how responsibilities are described, or attempts to apply newly learned language, it may appear as operational behavior rather than exploration. This is where misunderstandings often occur. People believe they are still learning. Systems may interpret the same behavior as activity. Recognizing this difference often helps prevent unnecessary exposure while understanding is still developing. Maintaining an educational posture. Continuing to learn safely often requires maintaining a clear distinction between education and execution. Education focuses on comprehension. Execution introduces change. As long as learning remains focused on understanding systems rather than altering interactions with them, the process can continue without introducing signals that administrative systems are designed to evaluate. This discipline reflects the sequencing that Patrick Devine emphasized in his teaching. Understanding systems came first. Interaction with those systems, if it ever occurred, came later. Much of the confusion in modern interpretations arises when those steps are reversed. When people attempt to apply concepts before fully understanding the environment they are operating within, the learning process can unintentionally create consequences. Maintaining an educational posture preserves the space needed for literacy to develop. Closing. Learning does not require urgency. Understanding systems takes time, patience, and careful observation. When curiosity is paired with discipline, knowledge can grow without creating unnecessary exposure. This volume does not ask you to change anything about your current circumstances. It has simply clarified how administrative systems interpret patterns of activity so that learning can continue without unintentionally triggering those systems. The purpose of this chapter, and of this entire volume, is not to restrict exploration. It is to protect it. When learning remains separate from action, clarity has room to develop. And when clarity develops first, future decisions can be made with far greater confidence and far less risk. A note about the next stage of study. At this point in the discussion, many students begin asking the same question. If financial activity and structural changes can affect benefit eligibility, how can someone eventually organize their affairs responsibly while still protecting the benefits that they currently rely on? That conversation does exist. However, it does not belong inside this volume. This book is part of the Foundations and Risk Literacy series, which exists to slow the learning process down and ensure that students understand the administrative environment they are operating within before attempting to change anything about their circumstances. The discussion about protective structures and fiduciary administration is addressed later within the Patrick Devine 7-part series, which is available through our educational channel. Within that series, Volume 8 of Series 2 examines the administrative safeguards that must be in place before someone attempts to organize responsibilities around benefits, fiduciary roles, or structured oversight. Those discussions focus on preparation, documentation, and responsible administration, not on bypassing oversight or avoiding institutional systems. The sequencing is intentional. First comes literacy, then comes discernment. Only after that can discussions about structure and responsibility begin. Attempting to build structures without first understanding the risks often creates the very problem people are trying to avoid. This volume is focused on awareness and restraint. The Patrick Devine series continues the education by examining the administrative discipline required before anyone attempts to take on fiduciary responsibility within structured systems. Understanding the difference between those stages is one of the most important disciplines in this entire field of study. Closing reflection. Protection is part of the process. This volume was never meant to accelerate you. It was meant to protect you while everything else slows down enough to make sense. Benefits protection and risk containment are rarely discussed because they do not feel empowered in the way World claims do. They do not promise leverage. They do not offer shortcuts. They do not create the illusion of control. What they do instead is preserve choice. Throughout this volume, the same theme is surfaced again and again. Harm does not come from learning. It comes from mistimed movement, from confusing understanding with readiness, from allowing curiosity to harden into action before the conditions for action truly exist. Restraint in this context is not fear. It is discipline. By holding learning internally, by recognizing where money changes posture, by understanding how systems interpret behavior rather than intent, you preserve your ability to move later, on your terms, with clarity and without unnecessary consequence. This volume exists as a safeguard, not an obstacle. It does not close doors. It keeps them from closing prematurely. If you finish this volume with a greater appreciation for timing, that is the outcome it was designed to create. If you feel less urgency and more clarity, that is not stagnation, it is stability. Protection is not separate from the process, it is part of it. Looking ahead, introducing Volume 5, QSIPs Explained. Securities identification, misuse, and common myths. As learning continues, another concept inevitably appears, often surrounded by certainty, speculation, and dramatic claims. The idea that hidden securities exist, that bonds are attached to identities, that numbers assigned at birth unlock concealed financial instruments. At the center of many of these claims is a term that sounds technical enough to feel authoritative, the QSIP. Volume 5 exists to bring clarity to that conversation, not by dismissing questions, but by grounding them in reality. QSIPs are not mystical identifiers. They are not evidence of hidden accounts. They are not assigned by both registrars, the Treasury, or the Federal Reserve. They are securities identifiers administered by CUSIP Global Services, created for a specific purpose within regulated financial markets. Understanding what a CUSIP actually is and what it is not matters, because misinformation in this area has led many people down paths that collapse under even minimal scrutiny. This next volume will explain how securities identification works, who assigns CUSIPs, why hidden bond guarantees persist, and where the misunderstandings begin. It will separate legitimate financial infrastructure from myths that have been repeated often enough to sound plausible. Just as this volume slowed down the conversation around benefits and risk, the next volume slows down the conversation around securities and claims. The goal remains the same: literacy before leverage, clarity before conclusion, and understanding that holds up when examined.
All right, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. We will conclude next. I'm not sure if you were able to hear me. Thank you guys for joining tonight. I want to thank you all for joining, and we will see you next week for the CUSIPs class, and that next week will be March 17th. Just keep in mind, if you liked our video, please like, share, and subscribe, and we will see you next week. Have a good night.